So I often give talks about native plants, and this time is a little bit different. So this particular talk is not just a list of very cool plants. I've done that in the past, and you can find that on the Sloat YouTube channel. The one Plants as Art has some real beauties. This real beauty is in my garden right now. This is a native iris. They know how to shave. They're not bearded. And so I love those talks, but instead I'm going to talk about a plant community and how the total of the plants that are happy together are greater than the sum of its parts, and the whys of choosing native plants. And I was thinking to myself when we got our first house in 1983 with total weeds and gravel, totally blank slate, and I was contemplating what to do with the garden. And I read tons of garden books, English gardens, French gardens, Mediterranean gardens, and finally saw a little ad for the California Native Plant Society in a beautiful magazine called Pacific Horticulture, and said, oh, well, how about a native garden? And never stopped. I had been looking up at Mount Tam. We were in Mill Valley at the time, and everyone had lived through the drought of the 70s and had to turn off their irrigation and let their lawns die. And they were nonstop complaining about that. There's more than a few Karens in Southern Marin. And I look at Mount Tam, southern exposure, rocky surface, and the plants are all alive. I'm like, let's go there and let's explore them. So you can expand your garden from a garden of plants to a garden of all wildlife. And one way to think about it is just think about the plants that were there before 1542. I used to say before 1492, but that was an East Coast contact between Europeans and the Americas. It took another 50 years for Cortez to sail around Cape Horn and come up South America, Central America, and finally California to have European contact, European animals and plants with California. And that's started several avalanches that we'll talk about. You can still take a hike and see remnants of totally native landscapes in every single county in the Bay Area. And try to get a feel for a plant community. What do I mean by a plant community? If you're flying in a 60,000-foot elevation balloon, I don't know why I that up, but you would see California in broad strokes, desert, mountains, primarily with conifers, and then the lower foothills would have broadleaf trees like oaks. The Central Valley would be largely a wetland with actual rivers before they were dammed off. And then you get the beautiful, beautiful coastal communities that most of us live in. So that would be the macro view of plant communities. And they obviously change over time. This year, Nevada's came up. They made a rain shadow. But in our lifetime, since we're not going to live 3 million years, they're going to look static. And they're going to be a collection of plants and animals that are going to get along in one area and provide a diverse population. Biodiversity gives you such resilience. If there is frost or drought, or even recuperation from a fire, the biodiversity of plants also gives you flowers all the months of the year for insects. The flowers mature to seeds for animals that want to eat seeds like birds. They need higher calorie food because they're bigger and have a higher metabolic rate. So you have a grocery store available outside every single month of the year. So biodiversity is key. But you're like, well, I don't have half of California. I'm not one of those land grant people. And you can shrink it down to your county. Marin County, as an example, has 12 plant communities, starting from the very beaches, the sandy beaches, to the hills just above the beaches with chaparral, and to mountains and woodlands. And you think about the coping strategies of plants in different locations. This is one of my favorite plants, which unless you're living on the beach, you're not going to be able to grow. So some of these are just for eye candy and looking, but this is called a sand verbena. And it has an anchoring root, but it's kind of like the ball at the end of a tether ball. When the sand dune shifts, the plant actually can shift and not lose its base root, but stay above the level of the sand and shift back when the sand dune shifts back. It also has an adaptation to reduce grazing because it has this sticky substance to accumulate sand so that anyone who tries to eat it breaks their teeth. So that is a defense strategy that this really lovely plant has. Under the in the forest, you're going to find shooting stars in the spring and 1,000 other beautiful wildlife spring flowers. And then you're like, well, if I'm stuck in one plant community, I'm limiting my choices of plants. But every plant community has hundreds of species that are happy in it. I mean, I've seen this Mimulus guttatus, this sticky monkey flower, in cracks of a storm drain in Terra Linda. And it's able to cope with that amount of modification of the environment. The Clarkias are in beautiful road cuts when you come out of Lucas Valley Road in June, and the whole side of the road is pink. And the stunning lily is a protected lily in Sonoma County. So you can't, even if you stick to a plant community that's most appropriate for your house, you still have lots and lots and lots of choices. So some plant communities like oak woodlands are very, very widespread, and some are extremely rare. There's just going to be little pin dots on the map of California. And the most rare, and one that you might not have heard of before, are called vernal pools. So this would be a depression in an area with the base layer being impenetrable clay, just like a natural swimming pool. And the rainwater fills it up in the winter and the spring, but it has no outlet other than evaporation. So the concentration of minerals in the water changes as the water evaporates, and the time of year that the ground is dry changes as spring goes on. And so one flower will make a ring for 1 month of the year, and then another ring for another month of the year, and it has concentric rings. So if you're in a drone looking down, you can actually see concentric rings. So if you ever get an opportunity to join a hike that includes vernal pools, sign up immediately. These are not plants that you're going to necessarily grow in your backyard. I'm just expanding the idea of options and niches that California contains these unbelievable plants. So even your yard is going to have multiple habitats. Now, this is not my yard, although that would be very cool. This is a county park called Helen Putnam. And even if you take the shortest hike and you're on the sunny side of the hill, it's going to be dry, open grassland. And you just cross over the crest of the hill and the environment completely changes to be completely covered with oaks, with lots of retained water, an understory of toyon and honeysuckle, and a whole different compendium of plants. So just within 5 feet of hiking from sun to shade, you're going to have a different set of plants that are going to be happy. So here's my house. No, just kidding. Here's a house that needs a little bit of landscaping. And so think of your house as a completely straight-sided hill. The south exposure is going to have the sun coming in, bouncing off the side of the house and reflecting down, and make a little warm area and a sunny area for the sun-loving plants. The house on the shady side will protect it from drying out too soon and provide shade for plants that enjoy deep shade, ferns and other woodland understory plants. And your east and west exposure might be your most variable and adaptable to flowering perennials and flowering annuals. If you have a depression that your neighbor overwaters and drains into your yard, you may actually have a wetland retreat for the rare plants that really need constant moisture. And if you have an absolutely dry hill, curiously, there are beautiful California bulbs that insist on a completely dry summer, elsewise they rot. So you can, with research, maybe use the tool called calscape.org, find a plant that is going to fit every single niche in your garden. So let's say you're an expert gardener already, and you know if plants like full sun, partial dappled shade, deep shade, moisture, periods of dryness, their architecture, how they grow, how big they get, what color they get, and you're an expert in ornamental plants. It's a big ask to become an expert in a whole new set of plants if you're not completely familiar with native plants and learn all that stuff about a new set of plants. So why am I asking for that big ask? It supports wildlife. It supports the birds and the bees. You can shrink your own gardening footprint because you're not mowing a turf lawn. You can have grass. There's 300 species of native bunch grasses in California, many in the nursery trade. They can live for 200 years. They can have roots that go down 20 feet rather than a few inches and survive without summer irrigation. And you're not going to use chemicals. The plants are drought adapted. If you look at the weather history of California for hundreds or thousands of years, there are periods of drought. Every summer is not considered a mini drought. Every summer is considered a Mediterranean type climate, which is on the west coast of every continent. So we know we have rain in the winter and a big gap from April to November some years of no rain in the summer. So that's the Mediterranean type climate that they're adapted to, and separately adapted to periods of low overall rainfall, which I'm going to call drought. Your planting native plants will slow down and mitigate habitat destruction. And especially if your neighbor does catch on and your neighbors, you're going to make native corridors. The really fun thing is if you get some surprise volunteers of native plants or insects and birds. There are seeds that are probably in your garden, and they may be brave enough to poke up their head. I know I anthropomorphize, but bear with me. If they've got native plants around them. So that would be a fun thing. And it gives you a lifelong learning opportunity. Just like a birder goes on trips to find new birds, botanizers go on hikes to find new plants. Speaking of new plants, not every native plant is in the nursery trade. They haven't figured out how to propagate some. This plant is actually real. It's not from a movie set like Little Shop of Horrors, but it is the famous Tiburon mariposa lily that grows in Ring Mountain in Marin County. And it was discovered in 1971. And think about all the houses that were built in the 50s and 60s in Tiburon, and people were walking around right by this flower and not seeing it. It's actually more gold in real life. This looks a little beige. And it flowers in the summer, and the flowers are the same color as the golden grass, and they actually point down. So little mice can look up and look at them. But there are new discoveries to be made, and there are plants to be brought into the nursery trade. But a backbone of native plants is available to you. So the big ask, why bother learning about natives or considering native plants? What does it even matter what plants you grow in your own garden? And it really comes down to how much you want to contribute to the overall health of the bigger environment. Birds are not going to stay within your garden. They're going to fly around, and so are insects. So if you want to help organisms outside your yard, plant native plants, along with maybe some delicious edibles. So I always wondered why native plant areas were always so beautiful and a vacant yard is just hideously ugly. I mean, where does the aesthetics come in? And it finally dawned on me listening to Doug Talamete's talk. He's given 1 million talks, and including Sloat, and has books. And he said, well, plants don't necessarily want to be devoured. I mean, they do share, they do photosynthesize, and they do make food, but they don't want to be devoured. So there is a development of relationships that takes a long time. Think about how long it takes you to make a friend. I mean, it takes me a long time. And when you get a group of plants and animals together that are cool together, that have fixed relationships with each other, you can have a venue that is more beautiful than any Chelsea Garden Show exhibit, although they're pretty cool too. So the two extremes, the strategies to what I call limiting the nibblers, would be the oaks. They are a keystone species. And they're like, come at it. I'm going to grow so big. I'm going to have enough leaves to feed all the caterpillar species that want to nibble on them. And I'm going to make enough acorns that all the woodpeckers and all the jays and all the insects that want to drill those tiny little holes in the acorns so their larvae have something to eat when they hatch. There's going to be enough acorns for them as well. Because in my lifetime, because oaks talk, right? In my lifetime, I'm going to make 1.5 million, 2 million acorns. And in order for me to reproduce myself once, I only need 1 acorn to grow up and survive. And all those other millions of acorns, I'm going to share to the world. So that would be a keystone species that is going to outgrow its nibblers. An oak is so remarkable that if you have an infestation of caterpillars that completely defoliates the tree, eats every single leaf off it, and you're like, oh, I'm convinced it's dead, there's enough reserve in the roots and the stems to make a whole new set of leaves, and the tree will not die. It's amazing. Those caterpillars are actually the high-calorie, high-fat food necessary for birds to feed their babies. So you want caterpillars eating your leaves in your oak tree. But other plants are going to be more circumspect, and they don't want every single Tom, Dick, and Harry to come around eating them. And so they are going to produce something horrible, something that tastes bad, or something that's actually poisonous to limit the nibblers. Well, if there's all these plants around, some caterpillar is going to have some genetic mutation that makes it able to eat this huge food supply that no one else can eat. They're going to have more offspring, and you're going to create a tight relationship between the plant and animal. More toxin, more restriction, more workaround, more toxin, etc. And you finally get a steady state where the plant is happy, the animals are happy, and you're not going to wipe out the plant population, but you're going to be able to support the insect population. And milkweed is one of those examples. So let's delve into the toxin strategy. Milkweed makes milk, which is really latex. Latex is made by a lot of plants, including those stupid dandelion weeds in your garden. So plants do photosynthesis. They provide food, clothing, and shelter for every single animal on the planet. And they're generous to a point. But if they're completely devoured, that would be an evolutionary dead end. So they can create physical barriers like thorns and such. Think of the beautiful acacia trees in the African savanna, very tall, 4-inch thorns, and the giraffes have to reach up very high to nibble super carefully between the thorns to get their leaves. And that's what makes those beautiful savanna sunset shots with those incredible architecture trees. Plants can make chemical barriers like toxins. And latex actually acts like a glue, so the tiny mouth parts get glued shut. So let's say latex isn't enough. So they're going to go beyond latex and create cardiac glycosides. Now, this is not a monarch butterfly, but this reminds me to remind you that different orders of insects have all invented a workaround with this particular toxin. And isn't it curious that the coloration is pretty similar to a monarch butterfly, even though it happens to be a bug? So these cardiac glycosides are highly, highly toxic. One of them was purified to a medicine, digoxin or digitalis, but just a teensy bit too much medicine can produce horrible side effects, including death. But the monarch caterpillars eat the leaves with impunity, scarf it down. So have you ever wondered, I was like, okay, these butterflies are bright, colorful. You can spot them far, far away, and they fly really, really slowly, and they're landing on flower to flower. The adults only drink nectar. They have that beautiful proboscis they unwind and surf up by that nectar, but they're not eaten by birds. I mean, they're not fast, they're not, anybody can catch them. So they are so filled with toxins that if a bird does eat them, the bird has a non-fatal interaction. If the bird dies and the butterfly dies, then you have a no, you're not having a winning situation there. But if it's a learning encounter, if the bird spits out the butterfly and decides that for the rest of that bird's life, it will not eat anything that is orange and black, you get a learned behavior and a protective behavior, which is why the San Francisco Giants are completely safe from bird predation. And the other animals are like, well, I'll just color myself the same and I'll get protected too. So monarchs are actual botanists. There are 16 species of plants in the genus Asclepias or milkweed in California. And 2 of them are commonly in the trade. They are perennials, so they die down to nothing in the winter. You think, oh, I've lost my entire portion of my garden. I don't see anything. And then they actually don't start coming out until April or May. They're really, really late to emerge. They're not a early spring plant. They're a summer plant. But these butterflies have taste receptors on their feet, and they can land on a plant and assess it. Oh yeah, this is actually an Asclepias. I'm going to glue my eggs onto these leaves. And so when the eggs hatch, and they're itty bitty little caterpillars that grow in stages to be full-size caterpillars, they're actually born, or hatch rather, on their food. And I initially thought that maybe the caterpillar detoxified it, made it a safe compound. But no, they tolerate the toxins and retain the molecule as is in their body, even through metamorphosis, so from caterpillar to butterfly. And that is why they teach birds a lesson to not eat them. So there's a great article that's in the references on the genetic mutations that the caterpillar had to create to be able to eat the milkweed where no one else can eat it. So they've got that food to themselves. And it turned out to be 3 genetic mutations in order to have the enzymes not be poisoned by the cardiac glycosides. It's an amazing, cute article. So you have this escalating arms race. I don't want to be completely eaten. I'll make a toxin. I'll invent a workaround so I can tolerate that toxin. Maybe I'll make a second one, tolerate, et cetera, et cetera. And in an open environment, like these straight borders between Oregon, Nevada, and California and Mexico, if an insect can't eat a plant in this area, they can just go across this arbitrary straight line, this geopolitical line, and eat a plant in that area. And you don't get that relationship building. But if you have an island, then you're stuck there and you better figure out a workaround. So California Floristic Province is not physically an island, but it acts like an island: ocean, mountain, desert. And it takes a lot of effort to escape, for a plant or an animal to escape. And so you've got to make do and find out a workaround and find out a way to survive in this environment, which is why we have so much endemicity, so many plants native to California found nowhere else in the world, and why we are labeled as one of 34 biodiversity hotspots in the entire world. The entire world. So just like Darwin's finches, a pair of finches went to Galapagos Islands, inhabited the different islands, had different food sources in the islands, and evolved over time to be able to eat those food sources, and eventually separated so much that they were separate species and couldn't breed each other anymore. We have a lot of divergent evolution in California over the millions of years that we've that plants and animals have been here. So what happens when you bring, on purpose or by accident, a pest plant? Now, not every non-native plant or ornamental plant is a pest plant, but those that escape and take over a hillside are pest plants. And most of those are not in the nursery trade anymore, thank goodness. Well, nature's picky, pickier than a 2-year-old rejecting anything you serve. So a plant that looks really similar to you is going to taste completely different to the insects. And then you don't have any insect predation, and then you don't have any food for birds, and you have this avalanche of problems with reducing biodiversity. So the brooms in California, there's actually 4 brooms: French broom, Spanish broom, Scotch broom, and a regular sweeping broom. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so they can take over hillsides. Their seeds can remain viable in the ground and sprout and germinate 80 years later. So it's a big problem. I myself took out a lot of Scotch broom, and like this guy grimacing here with his weed wrench. And I figured, well, they're just going to grow back. That's a stupid waste of time. But I noticed they don't particularly like growing under oak trees. So I planted lots and lots of acorns and put deer fences around the seedlings, because then you'd have islands that would be broom-free under the acorns, and actually changed the vegetation in the open area behind my house, which I'm super duper proud of. So you actually want your plants to be nibbled, which is a crazy concept, because you're going to avoid, hopefully never plant a pest plant that would take over a whole hillside and cause extinction of other plants. You're going to support plant diversity, because there are going to be lots of plants in one area, and diversity means that some plants are going to survive stressors like drought, flood, heat, frost, or diseases. Plant diversity also means every single month of the year, somebody's going to flower, somebody's going to have fruit, someone's going to provide the grocery store for the insects and the birds, all the months of the year, not just one time a year if you have one plant like monoculture. And lastly, you don't have to be the muscle. You're going to have all those nibblers. They're going to be your gardeners in your own garden, and you don't have to give a grimace like this guy and pull out Scotch broom that's 15 feet tall. So you're like, well, I like yellow flowers. Don't tell me I can't plant yellow flowers. Well, take a look at some options. Calscape.org has an advanced search, and you can put in sun, drought tolerant, the height, requested, the color requested, and find options. So buckwheat is a great keystone plant, lots of flowers for insects, very drought tolerant, lots of options of buckwheats. And this bright yellow sulfur buckwheat is just stunning in the garden. And of course, because it's native, it's much prettier. And it supports oodles of native butterflies and moths. Calscape.org, if you scroll down for the information of an individual plant, it'll tell you how many insects, butterflies, and caterpillars it supports. So it isn't just monarchs and milkweeds that have a one-on-one relationship with the caterpillars. Notice that the adult butterfly drinks nectar from a lot of flowers, but the caterpillars only eat the milkweed. We have the stunning pipevine swallowtail butterfly, and she, the pregnant female, the mom, has to find this plant, the Dutchman's pipevine, Aristolochia californica, to lay her eggs. In February, you have these saxophone-shaped flowers, which are actually a little more purple and green. They're just delightful. And in the summer, you have these large heart-shaped fuzzy leaves. It's really a beautiful vine. And you're supporting the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. You've got the anise butterfly. And the anise butterfly is a little more broad in her plant choices, because she can pick out pretty much everything in the carrot family, the Apiaceae. And so I picked a picture of the cow parsnip from the Cowscape website. And if you drive down 101 in Sausalito, and there's that big road cut on the right-hand side, after the rainy winter, you'll see these plants with these large compendiums, plate-size areas of white flowers, and that's cow parsnip. It's a really amazing plant. But there's lots of plants in the carrot family that are really, really cool. So you're really supporting the offspring of the anise swallowtail butterfly. So in conclusion, native plant communities provide habitat, and then results are greater than the sum of the parts. You're going to bring in birds, you're going to bring in insects, and you may even bring in some native plants that you thought were locally extinct on their own. So fusion is all the fashion with cooking, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes mixing up things too much may not be completely additive. And if you learn about the plant community that's most similar to your own garden, I think you're going to have higher, earlier success. And then you can add special plants as you go along. I like to experiment with multiple species and see what really likes my garden, and see what is thriving and what is living on its own with limited or even no supplemental irrigation after a season or two. And I'll add more of those and kind of not plant any more of those that seem to be struggling or just not liking my particular garden. And you will notice this, I guarantee, huge increase in the diversity of birds and insects in your garden. In my Mill Valley garden, when I was standing in the kitchen at the kitchen sink looking out the window, I would often see more than 10 species of birds. It would just be amazing. They would just be delightful. And then if you look at a more restrictive garden, lawn, ivy, agapanthus, you would find, I don't know, no birds. So I have included a few references. So Sonoma Land Trust talks about the biodiversity hotspot. The Scientific American really does a deep dive into how monarchs are capable of eating poison, basically cardinalides. And log into and find your own CNPS chapter. This one happens to be a link to the Marin CNPS chapter talking about plant communities. But there's a lot of other avenues to talk to with that. So calscape.org and California Native Plant Society, along with your Slope Garden Center, to give you your backbone of really healthy, really easy to start with shrubs and ground covers for your native garden, is something that you can consider. So I'll stop and see what Dan has got going on.
Well, I've just been listening and enjoying it. It's wonderful. The vernal pools are fantastic to see, by the way, and the spot that I found that I was really delighted with is called Table Mountain. It's northeast of Oroville, so it's probably a 2-day trip to enjoy it. so I did a roots tour back to Marysville and then went up to Table Mountain. But the vernal pools there are just spectacular, and they're probably, boy, they're in spades this year and will be there longer than usual because of all the rain we had. So you have a chance to see those.
There's that flower, the Dowingia, that looks like a face. It's just so charming. It's unbelievable.
And only grows in the vernal pools.
Right.
That's what's so cool. And your discussion of orange reminded me, first of all, that orange does not deter all birds from all places, because if you've ever been at a Giants game, by the end, you're being bombarded by the seagulls. So that doesn't always work. But on your milkweed, you will notice the orange aphids that can also tolerate the poisons in the milkweed. And where did they come from? They came from Europe, along with the oleanders that came across the ocean. And oleanders are fairly closely related to Asclepias and have the same latex and cardiac poisons in them that the aphids got used to. And so they are about the only aphids that can hang out on Asclepias. And as a result, they sequester the poisons, and the insects that mostly eat the green and brown and black insects around here can't eat the orange ones. So it's all an interesting circle of some kind. Now, I also wanted to say something about the Aristolochia, the Dutchman's pipe. And I learned this relatively recently in the last few years, that there are forms of Dutchman's pipe that are available in the nursery trade that are not the native Dutchman's pipe. And I want to caution people not to buy those, not to plant them, because they fool the butterfly into thinking that it's the right kind of Aristolochia to lay their eggs on, but their larvae cannot eat it. So you only want to plant Aristolochia californica, the native, and it's not widely available, but it's many of the native plant nurseries will have it.
Well, that's just like not planting tropical milkweed, sticking to the California guys because of the parasite, OE parasite.
Right. The tropical milkweed is the very pretty red and yellow one, or there's a pure yellow form as well. And because it doesn't die down in the winter, all the milkweeds harbor the OE parasite, but the natives that die down in the winter have a much smaller load of the parasite, where the tropical ones have a load that just stays there all winter. And then when the butterflies come to, when the larva eats it, the larvae are infected with the parasite, and then they don't develop properly in the pupal stage. Their wings are distorted, and often they can't survive. So it has now been outlawed, if you will, in Marin County. I hope other counties will follow, and people will stop buying and selling the tropical milkweeds.
And then you don't have to feel put upon by having that restriction, because if you really want a yellow flower, you can find something else. You know, like the sulfur buckwheat or whatever. Just look at Cowscape and you can find lots of options. So you don't have to be angry about it. You can just say, oh, this is an opportunity for me to learn some other options that are more naturally compatible.
Right. And there's even a third option, which is if you're absolutely determined to keep your stand of tropical milkweed, just be sure to cut it down to the ground in the fall, actually the end of the summer. By the end of September, it should be gone. And even though there are still monarchs fluttering about, they shouldn't be reproducing at that point. And the natural sources for them to lay their eggs on are gone by that time. and the tropical milkweed is just a trap for them to lay more eggs there that won't survive. So lots of reasons not to.
Yeah, so that's responsible land stewardship.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I'm looking at the Q&A here, and I do not see any questions. You covered everything so beautifully that people are not inclined to ask us anything. Well, in that case, I think we've done our job, and I hope I want to tell everybody that SLOAT has actually made a substantial effort this year to expand the native plant sections in the nurseries, and I'm pretty pleased with that. A few of them have had pretty good selections for quite a number of years, but others it was rather small, and so it's bigger now, and I hope that'll continue.
The SLOAT San Francisco always has had a huge selection, lots and lots and lots of options. It's been really, really fun to see.
Yeah, and Kentfield has always had a good big section, but now the others are starting to expand as well. And I want to give a shout out for the local native plant nurseries that are in each county, and be sure to visit them and spend a little money there, because they're an important place for getting native plants into the landscape.
Oh, I was going to mention, when you talk about peppers are a new world plant. And imagine, Hungarian cuisine without paprika, or Szechuan cuisine without paprika. So not only do we enjoy native ornamental plants, I mean, we're always enjoying new world culinary plants too: chocolate, vanilla, peppers, corn, potatoes, but mostly peppers.
Absolutely. Although peppers certainly are not native here in Northern California, and struggle a little bit with our weather. But we will talk about that in detail on May 6th, and I hope you all join me. Oh, wait a minute. Somebody has raised their hand. Are there better times of year to plant the native plants?
Well, turns out milkweeds actually enjoy getting planted now through May through June. They like planting later. Fall has been the traditional time to plant native plants, because then you get the winter rains and you get the roots getting established. This year, with our wonderful rainfall, we're going to be a lot more relaxed and have some spring planting, like now. But you can study all summer and then go like gangbusters starting in the fall. That's where most of the native plant sales are. And you can clear out areas of weeds and put your native wildflower seed mixes out in the fall as well, so they can come up. I've got some baby blue eyes and some flax and clarkias. And if I find a stand of clarkias, I'll let it go to seed maturity, and then take the dead plant, turn it upside down. It has little seed capsules that look like little vases, and sprinkle it down like, salt on French fries, and augment the seed cover for the next year. So it's really fun playing around with wildflower seeds and collecting your own seeds from your own garden.
Yeah, one of the ironies of all this is that by the time the wildflowers come out and people see them, and then come to a nursery or a garden set or whatever and say, wow, I see all those wonderful wildflowers out there, I'd like to plant some. It's really too late in the season to get them going. So the time to think about it is when you're not seeing the wildflowers, in the fall and the winter, when the rains come. That's the time to get the seeds down, or to start them and then transplant them. Don't go into the nursery when you see the stands of poppies in the fields and expect to reproduce that in a season. because it's just not doable. But on the other hand, it's easy to get some of the wildflowers going. And if you find a place that they like, and that's what's really critical, is you're offering locations to these plants, and the native plants are going to go gangbusters in the areas that they like, and they're going to struggle and not reward you in the areas that they don't like. And so you have to be experimental and observant and try to find the spots that are right for the different plants in your little corner of the world, which has probably several different exposures and wetnesses and all of that stuff. So
It's just like a good tennis coach. You go with your strength and you kind of hide your weakness. So plant them in 5 different areas, and the ones they like, augment there, and then do something else in the other areas where they're struggling.
exactly. Well, this is great. I always love these conversations, and hope people learned a little bit, and hope you get out there and hike around a little bit, observe, see what's growing in your vicinity of the Bay Area.
If you do something, see something on a hike, you can use Google Lens or Picture This or iNaturalist. They're not labeled like they are at the nursery or in a botanical garden, but you can find the name of beautiful flowers when you're hiking.
And you can also take pictures and bring them in. I'm happy to look at pictures and see if I can identify what you've been looking at, either in your garden or out in the world. When you're out hiking, it helps you to imagine what your part of the world might have looked like before it all got scraped off and rebuilt into neighborhoods. Keep in mind, I've said this before, but keep in mind that your soil at your home site is probably not the native soil that was here before your house was built. Especially if you're in a larger development, most of the soil was scraped off intentionally to level everything off and make the building platforms. And then some other soil was brought in from the outside and laid down on top of that. So don't expect your plants to act as though they're growing in the native soil that would have been there originally. And you may have to amend your soil, and you may have to give them a little bit of fertilizer, not a lot, all that sort of thing. Don't just expect that, oh, because I live here, I have native conditions, because in fact, all of our houses have changed the territory for everybody.
Right, it's an uphill battle for some of the plants to get established.
Right.
But oftentimes when you do have one that's established, then that drip line, so that microenvironment is a little happier and a little healthier, and then you can plant at the drip line the next plants and stuff like that. So you can sort of inchworm your way to a more sustainable garden. It's, my oak seedlings are way happier at the drip line than they are even 10 feet away. My success rate is in the fall, I collect acorns because I want to grow a forest.
Can't beat it. Well, thank you again, Joan. I'm sure we'll see you back again. I certainly hope so. And I hope everybody has a great day. And I will sign us off now.
Okay.
Ciao, everybody.